Live from London, this is BBC News. Europe braces for Trump's Liberation Day, but only he knows how far the tariffs will go. The last-minute lobbying has begun. The EU says it has a robust response waiting. Awful April is here. Water bills, energy prices and council tax all go up today, adding extra pressure to household budgets.
At Verify today, we've been looking into whether the government really is putting money into your pocket, despite all the bill rises.
The first test of Donald Trump's policies at the ballot box. It's election day in America. Republicans can ill afford an upset. At stake, 2 seats in Florida and a crucial seat on the Supreme Court in Wisconsin. And the death toll continues climbing in Myanmar, now past 2,700. A major rebel alliance says it will observe a month-long unilateral ceasefire to help the relief effort. Hello, I'm Christian Fraser. Welcome to Verified Live. President Trump says he has already settled on a plan for the tariffs he will announce tomorrow. Everyone else, it seems, is in the dark. It doesn't quite feel like the Liberation Day the president is describing. On Wall Street, 3 US markets signed off yesterday on the worst quarter they've experienced since late 2022. And while the president's trade advisor, Peter Navarro, is trying to sell tariffs as a tax cut, Goldman Sachs says the odds of more inflation and a recession are rising.
Tariffs on steel, aluminum, and pharmaceuticals. Reciprocal tariffs on our allies. Now a 25% tariff on cars, trucks, and auto parts. Experts are already talking about higher prices and the threat of a recession. Hardworking Americans can't afford all these tariffs.
On this side of the Atlantic, the Europeans are bracing for the worst. Germany's car manufacturers, France's luxury market, fashion, wine, champagne rely on exports to the United States for up to 20% of their income. The EU has already pledged a timely, robust and calibrated response, but the UK, it seems, will sit on its hands. The Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, thinks it is unlikely the UK will secure a carve-out tomorrow, but talks with the Trump administration are ongoing.
We do believe a deal is possible, and we believe one is in the national interest. So from what we understand from the US, it appears tomorrow there'll be no country in the world exempt from the initial announcements, but then there'll be the potential to reach agreement with the US on a better way forward. I believe the work that we have done, which I would want, ideally, to be frank, to have been able to exempt us from this moment. I think that our trading relationship is a very strong and fair and balanced one, so I don't believe there's the need to do this. But I do believe we're in a position to reach agreement.
Let's speak to Rebecca Harding. She is the CEO of the Centre for Economic Security. She's a trade strategist, and I know, Rebecca, because we have been on stage together before, that you do a lot of risk simulation, wargaming, a scenario just like this. If it is as bad as we think it might be, what happens next?
So I think what we're looking at now is something that is quite extraordinary. We're seeing the breakdown of the international trade system as we know it. We're seeing bilateral agreements between the United States and all of its allies and all of its foes alike. And what happens next, we can't tell because we don't really know what's happening right now. So we don't know what's going to happen with Liberation Day. We don't know who's going to be affected. All we know is that uncertainty is the new certainty, and that's a worrying place to be.
2 UK officials say they will likely only know when Donald Trump makes his announcement on Wednesday. It's very difficult to plan, isn't it, Rebecca, when everybody is at the whim of the US president and his mood on any particular day?
Well, I think this is a real difficulty. So, I mean, as you mentioned at the beginning, I do a lot of wargaming and a lot of planning around all of these things. And the main thing is that companies just have to be dealing with this type of uncertainty all the time because it's become the new normal. So companies don't know whether to invest or whether to hold off on investment. That's going to affect the global economy. And that's the reason why we're seeing all of these forecasts start to go downwards. It's the reason why the probability of a recession has gone up from all the major forecasters. So, I mean, it's just very difficult to plan under these circumstances, but that's exactly what President Trump wants. It's exactly what his administration want. They want to break the system. They want to disrupt things. They want to create havoc, and that's exactly what they're doing.
we'll get a political sense in a second of what the UK government might be proposing. But one of the concerns is that if goods can't go to the United States because they would be under tariffs and because there's reduced demand, then they might start flooding back to the UK market where no such tariffs exist. What is the impact of tariffs in one part of the world for another?
It just distorts supply chains. So, I mean, one of the weird things that we've seen happen over the last few months is actually the US deficit get larger. Now, one of the goals of tariffs is, of course, to shrink the deficit. We've actually seen the US deficit get larger because everybody's been trying to get stuff to the United States before this day happens and before tariffs kick in. Now, what is going to happen, undoubtedly, we've seen with automotive tariffs, for example, we will see the relocation of supply chains to the United States. Some companies are already doing that. If you look at Japanese companies, for example, a lot of them are already operating and selling in the United States rather than importing. But you're just going to see a huge amount of uncertainty, and it will affect global supply chains.
I suppose the Americans would say, Rebecca, that they have some of the lowest tariffs currently vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Is that fair? And are they, as Donald Trump would argue, levelling the playing field?
It depends how you look at it, because, and this is the whole purpose behind reciprocal tariffs, what they're doing is matching up what they charge and matching up what they think they are charged in terms of tax rates, VAT rates, corporation tax rates, tariffs, non-tariff barriers, things like regulations. They're adding up all of those things on one side and taking away what they think are the tariffs on the other side, so that they come up with some kind of a fair alternative. That's exactly what President Trump and his team are trying to do at the moment. They're calling it levelling the playing field, but of course in Europe, for us, it's actually undermining all of those trade relationships, because one of the things that we used to have was the World Trade Organization. We used to be able to go to the World Trade Organization with any dispute. We had this thing called most favoured nation, which basically meant that everybody had the same basic tax rate, and this is undermining all of that.
We've got a situation now where two of the United States' closest allies, South Korea and Japan, are putting their response together alongside China. Do you see global trade starting to shift and maybe a renewed focus towards, Asia and the Pacific region?
I think it's very interesting because China and Japan in particular have never been that friendly in terms of trading partnerships, and we've seen trade wars between those two countries. It's very interesting that China now is keeping quite quiet in terms of what it's planning to do, but has actually said it wants to behave multilaterally. The BRICS nations have all said they believe in multilateralism. What it's doing is it's throwing new alliances together. Even the European Union, and Christine Lagarde has said that actually what we need to do is become independent from the United States, both economically and obviously as well in defence terms. So this is turning into a complete recalibration of the way in which the international trade system works.
Rebecca Harding, always good to get your thoughts. Thank you for coming on the programme.
Thank you.
Of course, everyone is busy lobbying the White House right now, internally and externally. Let's get a view on what it holds for the UK. We can speak to our political correspondent, Helen Catt. So no knee-jerk reaction from the UK government thus far. Do they still think they can get a carve-out after the shock and awe announcement tomorrow?
Yeah, that seems to be the basis that the UK government is proceeding on, that they are unlikely to get a carve-out in time for tomorrow, but they intend to keep on talking, keep on negotiating, and they are attempting to negotiate this broader economic deal with the US, looking at things like technology, but taking in some other areas of trade in goods and services, including agriculture, and as part of that deal, getting a reduction in tariffs if they are put in, as we expect, tomorrow on the UK. So that is what the government is aiming for. Government sources say that these have gone pretty well, these negotiations so far, and they think they've pretty much got agreement. But the thing that could derail it is that it's perhaps President Trump's public comments, because some of the things he's said publicly in the past haven't quite, it's understood, matched up with what his own negotiators had thought he wanted. So there's still a lot of uncertainty around it, but that is the basis that the government here is proceeding on at the moment, that they are still trying to get this deal that they hope will reverse tariffs after the fact. They have said, though, that nothing is off the table. All options are on the table. That does include retaliatory tariffs, but they are very keen, really, not to end up in, well, as they put it, a trade war because of the economic damage that would inflict.
And in the worst case scenario, we would be facing 20% tariffs, Helen. That would lay waste, would it not, to the Chancellor's plans that were set out last week in the spring statement?
Yeah, this is the wider context to all of this, is the impact on the economy, because the Chancellor is dealing with reasonably thin margins at the moment to keep within the rules that she has set herself on borrowing, which are there, she says, to maintain the UK's fiscal credibility. She said she's not changing those. But a big shock to the economy, a big knock to the economy would then remove some of the buffer that she has built in, if not all of it, as some forecasters have warned. And if that happens, then she'd have to look again, if she's not going to change those rules on borrowing on things like taxes, putting up taxes, or cutting spending further. So that is the wider, bigger context and the big risk with all of this. Even not just the direct impact of whether or not the UK has tariffs imposed, but actually if there's any overspill from just the general global uncertainty around the tariff situation.
Would that mean that she would have to start looking at thresholds again, maybe tax rises in autumn?
There are lots of things that she would have to start thinking about again if she's going to decide she's going to keep those rules on borrowing in place. There's been some pressure from some in her party to look again at those rules instead, whereas she has been keen to suggest she wasn't going to come back with more tax rises. And then, of course, the Labour Party manifesto ruled out quite a lot of those taxes, the sort of levers that you might pull usually if you were Chancellor. So it's either that or look at cutting public spending further. So those end up being your choices. But of course, this is all hypothetical at this stage. What you're talking about there is that the thresholds, that's a way that governments have favoured in recent years, is freezing the threshold at which people pay income tax and extending the freeze. You'll forgive me, I can't remember exactly what year it's due to end currently, but extending that beyond the year it's meant to end, that brings more people into tax every year and raises the overall tax take without putting up individual taxes and giving that sort of headline.
Helen, thank you very much for that. That is very good context in mind of what we're going to discuss next. It's already difficult enough for families, and household bills are due to go up today for millions across the UK. Charities have warned that the rise in water charges, energy prices and council tax will stretch many households beyond breaking point, with single parents among the hardest hit. The Prime Minister has said that despite many rising bills, his government is following through on a promise to make sure people feel better off. Ben Chu from BBC Verified has been looking into whether that is true.
Many people will be facing a slew of rising bills from today, including council tax, water bills, energy and car tax. And in a few days' time, firms will have to pay more in national insurance contributions, which economists think will be partially passed on to workers in the form of lower wages. But Keir Starmer and other ministers are suggesting that, in fact, this government is starting to put more money in your pocket due to a rise in the national minimum wage and the living wage, pensions rising above the rate of inflation and falling interest rates. So what to make of this? Well, there are a couple of things to bear in mind. First, a lot depends on who you are and your family's circumstances. Someone on the minimum wage might be better off overall after today, but higher earners or those who are not working might be worse off. And the impact of these bill rises depends on what you spend money on, whether you have a car, for example, and in which part of the country you live. Water bills, for example, are rising at different rates in different areas. Second, it's quite important to distinguish between wages and incomes, which include benefits and the state pension. Let's start with some context on wages. Here's average weekly wages in the UK adjusted for inflation. There has been growth, as ministers point out, since the election last year, but it's not a huge amount, only around £4 a week between July 2024 and January this year. What about incomes? Well, this shows one of the government's own chosen target measures, real household disposable income per person. This is average incomes adjusted for inflation and what people have to spend per year after most taxes and benefits. Since the election in the middle of last year, this measure has risen very slightly in the final 3 months of 2024, the most recent period for which we have official data. And what's going to happen over the coming few years as all bill rises and tax rises and benefit cuts take effect? Well, we can't be sure because it will depend on what happens to the overall economy. But for what it's worth, here's the latest projections from the official government forecaster, the Office for Budget Responsibility. The OBR projects average incomes to rise by around £160 by the middle of 2029, or around £650 on an annual basis. But as this shows, in the context of rises over previous parliaments since the Second World War, this would not be particularly strong growth, only around 0.9% a year. Now, to stress, the outlook is extremely uncertain and these official forecasts might prove too pessimistic, but they do suggest the next few years will continue to be pretty tough on a lot of people's living standards.
Well, thanks to Ben for that. If you have been impacted by the changes today, we want to hear from you. You can get in touch with your voice, your BBC News. The details are on screen now, and we will be answering your questions at 5:30 tonight, 17:30 BST here on Verified Live. Just some breaking news to bring you from Thames Valley Police. Apparently they were called to reports of a man carrying a firearm at Milton Keynes railway station earlier today, just before 1 o'clock. Thames Valley Police armed officers responded. They challenged the man before shots were fired by police. We understand that life-saving action was taken at the scene, but the man carrying the firearm was pronounced dead shortly after. There's not believed to be any further risk to the public at this time. Our reporter is en route to Milton Keynes railway station, so we'll get you a report on that shortly. But one man killed who was carrying a weapon at Milton Keynes railway station early this afternoon, shot dead by armed officers. We'll take a short break. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. Welcome back. Millions of voters head to the polls in America today to cast their first official verdict on Donald Trump's second term. It may provide us with the best evidence yet of whether the president maintains support for those tariffs and the cuts he's pushing, or whether we will see today the first signs of some resistance. Certainly in some of the recent national polling, there is evidence, as you can see on screen, that his approval rating is under pressure. All but one of those polls show that the disapproval rating is up. At stake today, 2 Ruby Red House seats in Florida vacated by Matt Gaetz and the National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. We may be looking at margins of victory in those races. We'll find out in a second. In Wisconsin, they are voting to fill a vacancy on the state Supreme Court. The choice between a conservative, Judge Brad Schimel, and his liberal opponent, Susan Crawford. Though some say the race is less about the court and more a referendum on Elon Musk, who spent millions on political ads bashing Judge Crawford. He spoke for nearly 2 hours at a rally on Sunday night in Green Bay, stumping for Schimel with a cheesesteak on his head.
We want to restore individual freedoms, freedom of speech, just in general, get the government off your back. And and then make sure that you succeed in the United States as a function of your hard work and your talent, and nothing else.
Let's talk to our senior North America correspondent, Anthony Zerka, who's gone off to Florida to watch these two races in the Sunshine State. The margins, is that what we're really watching here? Because these are two ruby red seats, Anthony.
Well, I think the seat in the Panhandle, the one that Matt Gaetz held, it looks like the Republicans are going to be able to win that fairly comfortably, although the margins, as you mentioned, might be less than what we saw Donald Trump do in that congressional district last year. Here in Daytona Beach, this congressional district stretches to the west and north along the beach here. And actually, there are some pollings that show Josh Weil, the Democrat, within striking distance of Randy Fine, the Republican. There was one public poll that had him just a few points behind. There was a private Republican poll that was released that showed the Democrat actually ahead. This is a congressional district that Donald Trump won by more than 30%. So just the fact that we could be statistically in a dead heat is pretty shocking, but it makes a little more sense when you see that Weil, the Democrat, has raised about $10 million, which he's spending on this campaign from donations across the country, while Fine has only raised about $1 million. And a lot of Republicans even say that he's run sort of a lackluster campaign, assuming that he was going to be able to win comfortably in this seat.
Yeah, he's a bit of an abrasive character, isn't he? And he's been in a row with the governor, Ron DeSantis. The Republicans can ill afford an upset here because their majority in the House, Anthony, of course, is so slender.
It is. It's tiny. There are 4 vacant seats right now, the 2 here in Florida, and there are 2 actually that opened up when Democratic members of Congress died. If the Democrats win 3 of those 4 seats, they will take control of the House of Representatives. I think we can assume that whenever they hold special elections in those Democratic seats, the Democrats will win. So if the Democrats win these 2 Republican seats in Florida, they will flip the House of Representatives. So that's something that Josh Weil, the Democrat, emphasized over and over again when I saw him on the stump yesterday. It's also something that Randy Fine has mentioned to Republicans. They're both warning that these elections could determine the success of Donald Trump's agenda. Josh Field, the Democrat, says that's a promise. The Republican, Randy Fine, says that's a warning.
Yeah. Turnout in special elections is always much lower, of course, than a presidential election. But Democrats might be energized. I wonder if this is, as I said at the top, more a referendum on Elon Musk's largesse, and particularly his comments about Social Security, because we know there are a lot of sunbirds, a lot of older people down there in Florida who might depend on those benefits.
Social Security is a big issue here. Government services, veterans benefits. There are a lot of military folks, particularly in that Panhandle district that Matt Gaetz represented, who either live there or have retired there. So that is something that I've heard time and time again as a concern from voters here. That's something that Josh Weil emphasized, not only just the threats to Social Security that Elon Musk poses, but mentioning Elon Musk and Donald Trump and all the slashing to the federal spending and employment and services. He's warning that if Republicans maintain control of this seat, if they maintain control of the House of Representatives, then Donald Trump's going to be able to continue with this. This is a chance, he says, to stop it.
Anthony, always good to talk to you. Thank you for that. Let's bring in Liz Goodwin. She's a Congress reporter at the Washington Post to talk more about Wisconsin. If Republicans did win in Wisconsin, if Elon Musk can single-handedly affect a contest like this, then the question is how else might he inject himself into the midterms next year?
Yeah, Elon Musk has really made this Wisconsin race a lot about him. You know, he's gone personally. He's been handing out $1 million checks to voters, which is questionably legal. He had to kind of adjust that strategy a bit. He spent $20 million in this race, which is now the most expensive race for a court seat in U.S. history. So this race is unusual on so many levels, and Musk's involvement is probably the most unusual bit about it. And he has really framed it in this sort of life or death, high stakes fashion. He's saying the fate of Western civilization hangs on this court race in a state in the Midwest in the United States. And he's really betting he can bring out voters and tip that court to be more conservative.
Yes, I saw that quote. The entire destiny of humanity hangs upon it. I might beg to differ on this side of the pond. But anyway, I can see why it's such a heated debate. But what is at stake? I mean, why would it make a difference which of these two candidates wins?
Yeah, so on the local level, the court is, important. It decides abortion cases, all kinds of legal matters that, bubble up to the highest court in the state. It obviously matters. But I think what Musk is referring to is redistricting, most likely, which is that when the court draws up its congressional districts, when the state draws it often ends up in front of the Supreme Court of the state. So that could mean the difference between more Democratic members of the House of Representatives or more Republican members. And because right now the House is so closely divided, it could mean the difference of who controls the House, essentially. Just
a real quick one, Liz. What about Democrats? Because there's been some concern that they're not forming the resistance in Washington. Does this perhaps for Democrats, does this maybe become the launchpad today?
Yes, I think Democrats are watching all three of these races very closely, the Florida ones that you all were talking about before as well. If there is an underperformance among Democrats here and there's sort of a sign that Trump's voters are coming out for him even just a few months after he was elected, when normally, the voters of the party that wins the White House are a little complacent. They don't tend to come out and vote as much. So if they end up really coming out for Trump and Democrats are not out there, that's going to be a huge warning sign for the party. Then, the opposite is also true, that if they end up winning this race and overperforming in Florida, I think that will be a shot in the arm for them.
Big day for Democrats. Liz Goodwin, good to talk to you. Thank you very much. Plenty more on that on the BBC website. Do stay with us.